Dobro veče i dobrodošli na drugu panel diskusiju festivala Pomirenja. Prvog, nadamo se, u nizu i kao i svako novorođenče sa nekim svojim problemima, nekim svojim stvarima koje u hodu ispravljamo. Ja vas pozdravljam u ime celog tima festivala Pomirenja, u ime Filozofskog fakulteta, u ime Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju, Regionalni centar Novi Sad, u ime inicijative mladih za ljudska prava, u ime Austrijskog kulturnog foruma. Dakle, svi mi smo organizatori ovog festivala Pomirenja i družit ćete se sa našim govornicima i sa nama danas, sutra i preko sutra u ovom kreativnom distriktu koji još uvek se izgrađuje, ali nadam se da nećete zameriti. Dakle, ja sam ovde samo par minuta, evo da na neki način formalno otvorim festival, iako smo imali prepodnevnu sesiju sa našim dragim koleginicama iz inicijative mladih za ljudska prava i njihovim gošćama. Moje ime je Vladimir Mihić, za one koji ne znaju, koordinator sam festivala i zajedno sa svim ovim ljudima, neću ih poimence predstavljati, izvinjavam se, pošto ih je zaista jako puno, nadam se da ćete posetiti našu Facebook stranicu i videti. Smo zadnjih 2 godine radili na ovome i konačno smo pred vama i zajedno sa našim gostima da ispričamo neke zanimljive, važne priče na jedan možda malo neformalniji način nego što smo navikli svi u akademskoj zajednici da na neki način predstavimo društveno-humanističke nauke i sve ono što društveno-humanističke nauke znače jednoj opštoj populaciji. Pošto danas imamo još programa, moj zadatak je i da vas podsjetim i pozovem da nakon ovog panela, koji ćemo danas svi zajedno sa uživanjem slušati, da vas pozovem na druženje ovde u Opensu i ispred Opensa će naši dragi volonteri, studenti volonteri pripremiti neke zanimljive igrice za sve nas i malo da se podružimo, da popričamo. U 21 sat nadamo se na govornoj bini gde je trebao da bude i ovaj program, ali nažalost zbog kiše smo morali da ga pomerimo. Znači na govornoj bini koja je odmah tu pored nas. Očekujemo da će biti tamo predavanje Srećka Horvata i Davida Adlera. I sutra, odmah ću i to najaviti, ujutru se vidimo u 11 sati u ovom prostoru na panelu koji organizuje Institut za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju, takođe vrlo zanimljiv panel, on će biti unutra, s obzirom da je prepodne, a popodne nastavljamo naš program, ali to će najaviti, odnosno najavit će neko od nas sutra. Ja samo, evo, dozvolit ću sebi 30 sekundi da kroz 2 bitna primera, i razmišljao sam danima da li da ih spominjem ili ne, ali mislim da su jako važni jer se uklapaju u ovu temu festivala Pomirenja i zašto su nam ovakvi festivali jako bitni, zašto nam je Pomirenje jako bitno i zašto nam Pomirenje stalno izmiče. Oba su, nažalost, novosadska i nekako, čini mi se, ubedljivo govore da nam treba što više ovakvih razgovora na ovakvu temu. Jedan je, pretpostavljam da je većina vas čula, incident koji se desio u novosadskoj osnovnoj školi, kada su na završnoj priredbi dece 4. razreda puštana je jedna pesma sa vrlo spornim sadržajem, najblaže rečeno, gde niko nije reagovao na vreme i sada, kako to obično biva, svi se pozivamo gde je odgovornost nastavnika, gde je odgovornost direktora, gde je odgovornost roditelja, ali nažalost opet 2 dana prekasno. I drugi slučaj koji isto mislim da je naročito, da je izuzetno značajan, koji možda nije toliko poznat nekoj opštoj populaciji. Dakle, jedna ideja koja se nekako, rekao bih, na pogrešan način tumači kao pomirenje. Dakle, za nekoliko meseci, na samo nekoliko stotina metara odavde, očekuje se svečano otvaranje spomenika nevinim žrtvama 1944-1945. Spomenika koji je i projekta koji je izazvao priličnu buru u javnosti, s obzirom da su se na spisku nevinih žrtava našle i ljudi koji definitivno to nisu i koji su učestvovali u vrlo ozbiljnim ratnim zločinima u toku Drugog svetskog rata. Zašto to spominjem? Spominjem zato što ako pričamo o pomirenju, mislim da je jako važno, što ćete čuti sigurno od današnjih govornika danas i sledećih dana, da pomirenje jeste i kolektivna stvar, ali istovremeno to ne znači oprost na individualnom nivou svima onima koji su izvršili ratne zločine i da su ratni zločini nešto što je nosi sa sobom individualnu odgovornost i čini mi se moj lični utisak i da nije dobar način osloboditi odgovornosti sve one koji su učestvovali i u ratnim zločinima pod plaštom pomirenja i pod plaštom neke vrste prihvatanja da su postojale dve strane u sukobu. Tako da, eto, ja ću sa ovim nekim malo ličnim osvrtom i oprostiti mi još jednom na tome završiti ovo današnje otvaranje Festivala pomirenja. Nadam se da ćete se družiti sa nama i u ovom prostoru napolju, koji je, čini mi se, možda još primereniji, ali, nažalost, leto je tako kako je, pa onda moramo malo da improvizujemo i prepustit ću našim dragim gostima da popričaju sa vama sledećih sati i po vremena. Hvala vam.
Dobar dan svima i od mene. Moje ime je Tijana Karić, ja sam jedna od organizatorke ovog festivala i večeras bih ovaj panel otvorila nekim vrlo teškim pitanjima koja su vezane i za naš region, ali negde i za druge regione u svetu. Naprimjer, neka od tih pitanja su da li Jevreji imaju pravo na svoju nacionalnu državu, da li je Ruanda zacelila nakon genocida, da li je Kosovo Srbija ili nije, da li Bosna i Hercegovina treba da se ujedini i bude ujedinjena država bez entiteta ili ne, da li Kurdi imaju pravo da osnuju Kurdistan, da li je Oluja bila domobranska akcija ili pogrom, da li Makedonci govore makedonskim jezikom ili dijalektom bugarskog jezika, to je sada vrlo aktuelno pitanje. Da li kolumbijski FARC zastupa narod ili zastupa sopstvene interese, da li uopšte došlo do pomirenja u Severnoj Irskoj i kako će izgledati rusko-ukrajinski odnosi nakon završetka rata. Ova sva pitanja dele u srži slične procese o kojima ćemo mi večeras pričati, a o tome zašto su ovo pitanja bez jednostavnog odgovora. Ja večeras ovde razgovaram sa troje renomiranih stručnjaka u oblasti međugrupnih odnosa, konflikta i pomirenja i sada ću se prebaciti na engleski jezik zbog njih. So it is my great pleasure to welcome here tonight Dr. Nurit Schnabel from Tel Aviv University, Dr. Masi Noor from Kiel University, and Dr. Reza Bilali from New York University. Welcome. Okay. I would like us to start first just to present yourselves a little bit to the audience. The first question is for Dr. Schnabel. So how did you become interested in this topic of reconciliation in the first place?
Okay, so just before I answer, I want to say that I'm very happy to be here today. It's the first time in Serbia, and I hope that not the last time. And I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this festival together. And is it already, you already thanked everybody, or am I? No, so I'm saying I would like to thank everybody for coming, and also for inviting me and my colleagues.
We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you. So as to your question, I think that it's pretty straightforward in my case, because I was born in Israel. I was born in 1973, just before the Yom Kippur War. And since I remember myself, there was always some conflict-related violence going on. So, for example, in the 90s, during the Gulf War, we had to carry the gas masks everywhere. And there was a period in which we didn't take public transportation because buses were exploding every day. And maybe you heard that last year we had another eruption of violence, so there was lynching and bombing and missiles. And this April, for example, a student of ours in the School of Psychological Sciences in Tel Aviv University was killed in a terror attack in Tel Aviv. So it's always there. But I also remember times of hope, and I remember the excitement following the peace treaty with Egypt and with Jordan and with the Emirates. And we also have Arab students in our school, and I feel that each year their voice is becoming more and more present. And I also think that the fact that many of my collaborators are German is pretty amazing if you think about our common history in just 2 generations ago. So even though in my nature I tend to be pretty pessimistic, in my work I leave room for optimism. So that's why I'm here.
Okay. Thank you very much. I like the smile and the gloom that you're talking with when you're talking about these difficult topics. So it seems optimistic. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Noor, would you like to tell us how did you end up in this topic of reconciliation?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Masih Noor, and like Nurit, full of gratitude for the invitation to share this space with you. They say research is me search. It's also true for me. So I have lived experiences of conflict, war, loss of loved ones, chaos, and yet still making sense and meaning of very difficult, challenging situations. So I was born in '79, at the same time as the Russians were invading Afghanistan. I was born in Kabul, Afghanistan. So that's where I started. But I also spent some of my formative years in Northern Ireland, Belfast. And when I arrived in Belfast as a young adult, it was a very exciting, interesting time in Belfast. It was just when they were signing the peace accord. And so I was part of that. But I don't know, for me, it's all happening here and now. I will deal with death and what happens after this later, but so my purpose is to make sense of us, of conflict, of suffering, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. And I won't go too much. I'm happy to take questions later, but my request to you guys is that this is a shared space, and I hope that we can, in our dialogue, explore places that we've never been before in a true transformative way. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bilali, would you like to share how you ended up in this topic?
Sure. Again, thanks for having us here. It's my first time in Serbia, so hopefully not the last. I'm from the region, so I guess that's self-explanatory. I'm originally from Albania. I grew up in Albania in the 80s during communism, and experienced the fall of the system. And we had social unrest and civil unrest during the 90s. And that actually led me to kind of go and study social sciences, because I got really interested in social conflict and what seems like at that time like craziness. Plus, of course, the influence, we didn't experience the wars in the Balkan personally, but we were close by, so that also influenced my interests. Then I moved, for my studies, I moved to Turkey, to Istanbul. I lived there 7 years. I studied psychology and conflict resolution. And of course, Turkey is another place of, rich conflicts, right? Ethnic, religious, etc. So I got even more interested in understanding, right, intergroup conflicts there, and then had the chance to actually work in different countries, in Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and with colleagues in other countries that kind of deepened a little bit my interest in conflict and reconciliation.
Very nice. I have a very good question that I would like you to answer later. But let us first start with the very definition of reconciliation. So, what is reconciliation? How is it defined in social sciences?
So in psychology, we usually distinguish between conflict resolution and reconciliation, such that conflict resolution means addressing the tangible or the concrete aspects of the conflict. So, for example, if two rival groups decide on how to divide the land between themselves, or agree on a mechanism for compensating the victims for the damage done to their property or other kinds of damage. This would be a conflict resolution. And reconciliation would mean something else. It would mean healing the relations or removing the emotional or psychological barriers that block the path to more harmonious relations. And we conceptualized it as comprised of three components. One is the restoration of trust. The other is the restoration of equality, so there are equal rights or equal power between the adversarial groups. And the third is the restoration of positive identities, such that no group feels that they're viewed as the bad guys or the evil perpetrators or as the humiliated or weak victims. And the scientific study on reconciliation was inspired by external historical events. One was the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, in which after the fall of the apartheid regime, they encouraged perpetrators of political acts to confess for or tell the truth about their crimes in return for amnesty or a certain degree of amnesty. And another thing that encouraged or inspired research, scientific research on reconciliation, is the greater use of public apologies. So in the past, groups didn't apologize for their deeds because it was perceived as a sign of weakness. But in the last decades, there has been a greater use of public apologies. So for example, both the Canadian and the Australian governments apologized to the indigenous population for the cultural genocide. And do you want me to talk about my own research on?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, so I mentioned that the Australians and the Canadians apologized to the indigenous population. And in my own work, or the needs-based model of reconciliation that I developed in my work, we first listen to the language that people use when they talk about the apology forgiveness cycle. So they say things such as, you owe me an apology, or I accepted your apology, or they talk about granting forgiveness. And this made us think about reconciliation through the apology forgiveness cycle as a social exchange interaction. So the victims and perpetrators give and get something from each other, but the commodities that they get are symbolic or psychological in nature. And then the next step we ask, okay, so what can victims and perpetrators get from each other? And to answer this question, we turn to social psychological theorizing about the big two. So theories in social psychology argue that there are two fundamental content dimensions along people judge other individuals or other groups. One would be the competence dimension, representing traits such as agency and competence and intelligence and power and dominance. And basically it's the ability to determine your own fate, to determine your own outcomes. And the other dimension represents traits such as morality or trustworthiness or love or warmth, and it basically refers to the ability to be in communion or the connection to other people. And what we argue is that victims experience a threat to their identity as agentic, and perpetrators experience threat to their identity as moral. They feel that they're viewed as evil, and they're motivated to restore their positive identities. So victims want to regain power, to regain control over their fate, to have their voice heard. And perpetrators want to, or perhaps I should correct myself, when I say victims and perpetrators, I mean members of victim groups and members of perpetrator groups, and they want to feel moral. They want to feel reaccepted to the community from which they feel potentially excluded because of the things that their group, of the immoral acts of their group. And one way through which victims can feel can regain their power is by taking revenge, okay? Because when they take revenge, they restore control, they get control in their hands. And one way through which perpetrators can protect their moral identity is by something that we call moral disengagement. So they can undermine the severity of their harm, or they can blame the victims from bringing the harm upon themselves, or they can use justification or excuses to their group's behavior. But another way through which they can restore their positive identities is through this exchange interaction that I was talking about. So to the extent that perpetrators acknowledge the injustice caused to the victim, we say that this restores control to the hands of the victim, because this acknowledgement serves as an admission of owing a moral debt to the victims. And then the victims have the power to decide whether or not this debt will be cancelled or how. And victims can restore the moral identity of the perpetrator if they forgive them, or if they're willing to be friends with them, or if they express empathy and understanding to the circumstances that compel their behavior. And what we see in our studies is that when victims feel empowered and when perpetrators feel accepted, morally accepted, when they feel that their positive identity is restored, they are more willing to reconcile with each other. And
I wanted to ask, do you know, have you seen an example, or do you know of an example where this worked?
So I think that it can work. So I mentioned before that I have many German collaborators. So with one of them, Johannes Ulrich, we conducted a study that examined the model among German and Jewish Israeli participants. And what we found, so we did an experiment, and what we found is that Jews or Israeli Jews had a higher willingness to reconcile with a German when they received a message of empowerment from a German representative. And by a message of empowerment, I mean when the German representative said things like, Jews have the right to live, to be proud and in their homeland, or to be strong and proud in their identity, or we appreciate the contribution of Jews to the world. And Germans were more willing to reconcile with the Jews following what we called an accepting message, which says, we understand that it's not easy for Germans to live with the past, and we're all human beings. So this type of morally accepting messages increased the Germans' willingness to reconcile more than an empowering message. And we think that this model can explain the dynamics, or can help us understand the dynamics between victim and perpetrator groups in many contexts, such as in Australia and Canada and South Africa, and as I said before, between Germans and Jews. And for example, one of the things that we see is that many times members of perpetrator group project their own needs on the victim group. So for example, they express the need for mutual acceptance, the need to move on to a more harmonious future, and so forth. And they don't understand that the victims have a different agenda. So the victims don't respond very positively to these type of messages. So I think that our model can shed light on this type of dynamics and prevent this miscommunication. But at the same time, and now there's a big but, the model doesn't fit very well into a context in which there are mutual transgressions. Because what we see is that when both parties transgress against each other, they stay with their victimization for a long time. For perpetrators, it is much easier to move on. So the way we interpret it is as suggesting that the psychological experience of victimization is much more pronounced psychologically, much more profound psychologically than the experience of perpetration. So for example, I told you that this April, a student of ours, of our school, was killed in a terror attack. And I have a very, very vivid memory of this because I attended the funeral, and it was heartbreaking to see so many young people in the funeral. Usually I'm used to a funeral with older people. But I don't remember how many innocent Palestinians were killed in April, right? I have a very vague memory of that. So what we see is that because the experience of victimization is more profound, both parties remember mainly their victimization, and they often compete over the victim's role. And with this, I will handle the microphone to Massinou, because he did a lot of studies on what he called a competitive victimhood.
Yes, actually that was my next question from Massi, was what happens when both groups transgress against each other? So when it's not that clear who's the perpetrator and which group is the victim group. So what happens then? Because this model works in those cases where that line is more or less clear. But what happens in other conflicts like we have here in the Balkans also?
Sure. So let me first of all say that I love the need-based model of reconciliation, but also it always reminds me of a phrase that a scientist said: models are stupid, and we need more of them. And Nurit's model is beautiful; it's not stupid. But I remember in 2008, I think, reading her paper, really, really engrossed. And of course, when you see things so beautifully presented and so consistent, I always get nervous, or I get an itchy thing in me, and I go, where are the weaknesses, where are the flaws? And that's where I used in some of my lived experiences, especially in Belfast, where like I was an outsider in Belfast, so I had access to both sides of the conflict. And there was an interesting phenomenon happening whenever people would meet me. So each side would try to convince me that they had suffered more than the other group. And it's so pervasive, it's so common in Northern Ireland, and later I discovered it's almost a little bit universal in most conflict settings, that in Northern Ireland they have an expression for that. It's referred to as the talk of whataboutery, meaning if I'm a Catholic and you're a Protestant, and I remind you of the atrocities that your community did against mine, instead of you acknowledging, you challenge me back and say, but what about the other event? So little did I know that I would, at some point as an academic, use that experience and contribute to Nurit's model and get a chance to work with her. So yeah, competitive victimhood as a concept is just as simple as I said. It's the subjective beliefs, sentiments, understanding even of conflicting groups that their group has suffered more than the other group as a result of the conflict. Now, it's not just about the quantity of suffering. It's also about, so not only have we suffered more than you lot, but our suffering was decidedly more unfair, more immoral. So there's a moral quality dimension to competitive victimhood. Let me tell you a little bit about the kind of what I talk about, the psychological infrastructure of competitive victimhood. So I think what makes competitive victimhood such a potent, versatile concept is it's so versatile. So you can apply that to so many different dimensions of intergroup relations. So to give you some examples, it could be used in terms of just numbers of physical death and injury. Which group has suffered more? So you can quantify that. There's another material dimension, which is economic deprivation. So as a result of the conflict, my group was exposed to, economic deprivation more than your group. There's a cultural dimension, you can apply that too. As a result of the conflict, as a result of what you've done to our group, for example, we no longer speak our native language. An example would be, for example, Ireland. No? Not many people speak Gaelic, their original language. But the cultural dimension also is related to it's beyond the language, beyond the cultural heritage. It's almost like what you've done to us is threatened our way of life. So it's almost verging on existential threat. Of course, there's also a psychological dimension. You know, what you've done to us was more psychologically traumatic. And its impact gonna last much longer than what we did to you guys. There's also what I call an attention dimension, or a media competitive dimension, where, especially nowadays, in the last 10 years, people compete over how their suffering is reported. And, you know, our suffering is underreported or misreported compared to your suffering. So these are the dimensions across which groups can dynamically compete over this suffering. Now, you might end up asking, like, what do they get from that? What's the psychological function of engaging in competitive victimhood? There are many, unfortunately. So one prominent one is denying the responsibility of your group inflicting harm on others. So, I mean, one extreme context that I can think of is the genocide context. I was told that in Rwanda, the group that was responsible for the genocide there, you know, their comeback is, well, if we hadn't done what we did, the other side would have done it to us. So that's denial of responsibility. But also, well, as you know, this is, as we all know who have experiences with conflict, conflicts have an emotional dimension too. You know, sometimes we might feel guilty, ashamed, or embarrassed, as well as pride and other positive emotions. So we also think that actually by engaging in competitive victimhood, we can manage those negative emotions better. You know, they pushed us. They forced us. We were against the wall. What else could we have done? It was self-defense. And I guess the last function, or the prominent function, would be it tells a very simple but powerful story about who we are. So it gives you provides you a basis for demanding loyalty from your group, projecting coherence. I mean, the bond of suffering. I can't think of any other more potent bonds, you know, that suffering than suffering can create. So I've talked a little bit about the dimensions and also the functions. We know its impact on intergroup relations. It delays any attempts on motivation to reconcile with the other. It affects trust. It certainly affects forgiveness, a topic that is very close to my heart. But in fact, actually, it was Nurid and another dear colleague, Sama Halabi, a few years ago. We conducted some studies. So is there anything you can do about reducing this need of competitive victimhood? And in our case, what we tried to do, and it seemed to be working, was through very basic interventions, reminding people that, yes, they may have suffered in different ways, you know, compared, you know, the Middle Eastern context. Israelis have suffered as a result of the conflict in different ways than Palestinians. But as a result of the common conflict, as a region, as they share that suffering. And in a way, maybe the tears of a Palestinian mother is no different than the tears of that student's mother who was killed recently. And it seemed that that kind of intervention promoted and fostered more forgiveness and reconciliation attitudes. So I'm going to make a stop here. So that
You answered all the questions that I had, so,
so I'm done.
yeah. Not quite yet. Yeah. So thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to Reza, because this competitive victimhood is actually a part of a broader concept that we call in social psychology exclusive victimhood. And what we need to improve intergroup relations is actually the opposite. We need inclusive victimhood. So victimhood stays because it's a fact, it happened. How do we turn from exclusive to inclusive victimhood? Is it possible? How is it done? And what role do historical narratives play in this process?
Yes, so I'm going to give you a long answer because I'm going to go back to, to previous points by Nurit and Masi. Because the two ideas, the needs-based model and competitive victimhood, was presented as clashing, but I actually see them, I don't see them as clashing, and I actually see the needs-based model as applying to different contexts, including in contexts where there are, harm committed by both sides. And maybe that's because, the way when we talk about perpetrator and victim groups, that's kind of an essentializing, as if groups are essentially the perpetrator or victims. It's easier for us to say that, but the way that I see this process is more in terms of the actions. So perpetrating harm, right, threatens morality of the group and some of the needs, and being harmed, right, also threatens, status and power. But you can think, if you take on a history of conflict, you can slice it up, right? If you slice it up on time, and in every conflict, even in cases in genocide, take a larger view, right, a larger historical viewpoints, and there will be, right, those slices where there has been, right, harm from other sides, maybe at a smaller scale. But in those instances, right, and the other group is, in each instance, right, you can be the perpetrator, in another instance, you are the victim. And each of those, I think, threaten, right, certain needs. I think, this is relevant to the competitive victimhood because, I want to mention, like, a critical driver of competitive victimhood that I think also serves to meet these needs, but in a way that doesn't serve reconciliation, are historical collective narratives. So historical narratives of conflict, typically, we learn about our history of the group, about who our friends are, who our enemies are, through, stories in our families, in our communities, through media, education, right, history, artifacts, public, right, artifacts that we see. And those, in conflict settings, as I'm sure, right, everybody knows here, those stories always, across countries, right, they always present one's group as the victim, and the other group as the perpetrator. If you ask group members in different sides of the conflict to tell the history, they will come up with very different histories of the same conflict, right? Typically, even the origins, the starting date is likely to be different. Which events are important are likely to be completely different. So the timeline of the conflict is different. Even if they talk about the same event, they are interpreting it in very, very different ways. With my colleagues, we've kind of analyzed or look at, how they differ, right, from the perpetrator, victim, or victim groups, like these stories. And what we see is that they vary not erratically, but there are some systematic, right, characteristics of these narratives in ways that they serve for perpetrator groups to reduce responsibility for any harm that has been done. What that does is, protect the in-group's morality, right, because you don't remember, you silence the events that in which our groups have perpetrated harm. So it's unlikely, for instance, in schools that we learn about events in which our groups have harmed others. That's not typical across the world. That's not what our history books teach us. And for the victim groups, so it has, these narratives for perpetrator groups have the function of protecting in-group's image, in-group's morality, and protecting group members from negative emotions that might arise from these, harm doing, and also in reducing and avoiding, right, responsibility and accountability. And for the victim groups, they are really focused on acknowledging the harm done, the severity of harm done, and establishing the accountability, right? They are all, focused on that. So you can imagine when there are harm conducted by both groups, right, over time in the more symmetrical kind of conflicts, then if you have these two narratives, you can see how that can lead to very competitive, right? Competitive victimhood, narratives of competitive victimhood that again I think serve to, in many ways to kind of meet these needs for the victim group. It's maybe not, it's empowering in the sense that they acknowledge the harm and they try to blaming and establishing accountability, and also establishing the moral high ground, the moral status, which at least in today's world, that's power, because it provides you allies, right, and sympathies from other countries and support from other countries or other groups. So it has those functions for meeting the needs, right, of the perpetrator and victim groups, but in a way that does not serve reconciliation, right, in a way that actually it inhibits and it perpetrates further the cycles of conflict. So then the question would be, okay, so how, what do you do about this, right? So then can we think about, what kind of narratives or what kind of, strategies could be used to actually meet the needs, right, the same needs, but in a way that, right, fosters reconciliation rather than inhibits it?
Yes. Do you have an answer?
I have an answer, yes.
Yeah. I may just maybe state a brief answer that the audience would know, probably because the majority is here from Serbia, I suppose, but very familiar with events in the region. When we talk about different narratives, conflicting narratives, we have abundance of them in our ex-EU countries. Yes. And for example, I'm most familiar with the Bosnia-Herzegovina case because that's my case study. You have three constituent peoples, so-called constituent peoples, three ethnic groups, and they have schools. In their schools, they're separated in schools, and they learn three different histories of the same events. So they do it in different languages also, saying that they're doing it in different languages, but also it is not clear, what Reza mentioned, it is not clear when the Bosnian War started, because there are two official dates. Was it the killings in Bijeljina or the killings in Sarajevo? So actually people there don't agree about anything that is related to the conflict. How many victims were there in Srebrenica? Were there 8,848? So the Serbs would say no, definitely not. And then the Bosniaks would claim there are still people, there are bodies, mass graves that are not discovered, so there are even more victims. So they're constantly in conflict. And these narratives influence every level of social life in these countries. And we also have them in Serbia. We have many of them. The most recent ones related to Kosovo, because that was our most recent war. But yeah, can we do anything with these conflicting narratives, and how do we move past them? How do we integrate them? Is it possible? What do we need to do?
Yeah, so in line with the examples that you provided, we did a kind of a review of both the literature, research literature, but also of civil society efforts to address narratives in conflict, right, in conflict societies. So, and many of those are focused on history education. And what's interesting, so, there are different approaches to at least civil society efforts. So one approach is, bringing groups together to create a common narrative. But that's also quite difficult, right, to do. And it has its drawbacks, and we can talk about those. Another approach is to actually have in schools to expose members of different groups with both sides, right, with both narratives of both groups, with the idea that, just exposure, knowing, right, what the other side's narrative is would be important to, increase openness toward the other. Another approach is to actually not focus on teaching narratives, but focusing on training, or teaching more critical historical thinking skills. So basically, give the skills to students, skills of a historian, so that they can think historically and think about go to the original documents and make their own make their own story in terms of looking at the complexity, right, of the different events. The problem is that with all of these, we don't have much research to show us like how they work. Do they, serve reconciliation? There is some research in Northern Ireland, actually, where in school education, in history education, where students, members of different communities, are exposed to different narratives. And kind of longitudinal studies over time in high schools, for instance, what they see is that students, by the end of their high school of this history education, they tend to still cherry pick the facts or the events that were presented that support their community's narrative. So by the end, of that education, they become even more entrenched to their community's stories that they started with, because they are selecting events that are, consistent with their story.
Chosen traumas, chosen glories. Right?
Chosen, yes, right. So, so we don't know much about, and part of it is that there is a lot of resistance, right? To you cannot do some of these programs because there is a lot of resistance from the public, politicians, etc. So I'm going to tell maybe one type of programs that I've worked with that are kind of a creative way to address narratives. And that has its mass media, it's through mass media. So these are called education entertainment programs. It's basically telling fictional stories through dramas. Think about TV dramas or radio dramas. Think about soap operas, but in this case, it's soap operas with an educational kind of content. So I worked for many years with different organizations that do this kind of dramas, focus on intergroup conflict and reconciliation, but they tell the story of the conflict that is fictional, right, in a soap opera that goes for years. And the idea is that because it's fictional story, the audience has less resistance to engage with different ideas and different perspectives in the story than if it was, telling the story of your group, So the stories are created by, of course, local writers who know very well their settings, and they are done in a way that people can really they can really identify with the characters in the story and with the experiences. So they describe the conflict, how it started, how different groups react, how different characters in each group react, why they become perpetrators, right? So you see that evolution, of conflict and process of reconciliation afterwards. And that is powerful because, it kind of humanizes in some way everybody, right? Whether it's perpetrators or not, because it puts, it really shows how, everybody can identify with different characters in terms of why they are doing certain things, how they are feeling, what's the impact of their actions. And also it breaks down a little bit this idea of one narrative for each group, because for each group you have very different stories and narratives, because there are different experiences. Groups are not homogeneous, obviously. And what I've done research on this, and what we've seen is that our impact studies show that these stories can reduce competitive victimhood, increase attitudes towards reconciliation, increase what I call historical perspective taking, meaning that people's openness to consider the other group's history and narrative as well, and to say, for instance, okay, the story that I've learned is not the only truth about the conflict, that there might be more to it. And also increase acknowledgement of responsibility for the harm that your group has done, that, okay, we have also done maybe some harm to the other group.
I'm already thinking what should happen so that we do that in Serbia, for example, or in some of our countries, but it's a very complex context to start with, of course, as any post-conflict society. But when should reconciliation start? Does it start just after the peace accord is signed, or is it an outcome that we should try to achieve, or is it a process? When does it start? Should it start? And when does it end? When is it achieved? Do we know that? Can we say that?
I think that first of all, in the meaning of reconciliation, people often interpret it as both the process and as an outcome. So I would say both. And if you think, for example, about Germans and Jews, this would be the outstanding case of reconciliation. But I sometimes feel that, or I'm afraid that maybe it was so successful because we're now in separated communities. Maybe if we still live together, it will be harder, because then the conflict is still going on. So, so this is about the process versus outcome, and when I think that it is what usually social psychologists would say, that they all should take place together.
Conflict resolution and
yes, conflict resolution in the sense of addressing the tangible resources, allocations, or like how to divide the land, or but yes, at the same time you also have to build the hearts, and it's hard to say which one precedes which, because in order to have people accept the peace treaty, for example, because peace treaty always involved compromise, so in order to be willing to compromise, they need to start building reconciliation. But at the same time, it's hard to reconcile when there is still conflict over land or over property going on. So I would say that probably you need to do the same, both simultaneously.
At the same time, yes. Masi would like to add some?
It's rare that I disagree with Nuri. It's not actually that rare. We disagree all the time on different things. But look, well, if I can summarize the impact of conflict, maybe at a very personal level, it's one of dehumanization. And regardless of who started the conflict and who ends it and who suffers more and who suffers in different ways, conflict and violent conflict, whether it happens in your family, community, school setting, or entire country, is a process of dehumanization. And it's self-dehumanization as well as dehumanizing the other. And if we accept that, then for me, reconciliation should start in the midst of the conflict, and maybe even start before the conflict, because it could be used as a preemptive measure for addressing, deep historical, psychological, societal, political, divisive issues.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, and I think it links also to how how you conceptualize reconciliation. If you see just like positive attitudes that we like each other, right? That's one. My conceptualization is broader, so it includes the whole process of it doesn't involve just individual attitudes, but sociocultural change and institutional change that are needed for societies to reconcile. And when I teach reconciliation, we teach conflict and reconciliation. When we think about conflict, we think about this bell-shaped curve, right? The evolution of conflict, where there is low conflict, it evolves, it reaches a peak, and it de-escalates and it goes down. So that's kind of the typical kind of curve. And I ask students, it's like, where should reconciliation start? And typically they say, well, at the end you have de-escalation because you have conflict resolution, going on at that de-escalation, and then right then when it's de-escalated, you can start reconciliation. Now the issue is that bell-shaped curve is, it's one instance of a conflict, right? Typically conflicts, they go up and down, up and down. So if you kind of think about, that, societies that are, in interaction with each other, they will have conflicts going up and down. So the end of that bell-shaped curve is the beginning of another. So you can think of that as, so I would agree with you that reconciliation efforts in terms of effort, not necessarily just, this idea that we should just start liking each other, but changes that that change the societal structures, right, or the group structures in ways that promotes, right, people to live in kind of peace with each other, should start, right, they can occur at any points and are important because they are, right, you can think of them as a prevention for the next wave, right, so, but sometimes, some, again, it all depends, because some type of programs that, if you're just focusing, let's forget about, right, the past, and then just, let's just get along type of programs can also backlash, right, if you just focus on that more on that more superficial, right, element at the wrong time, right.
Thank you. This now reminded me of a talk that we have last night in a pub. So I will just ask a question for Masi now, and then I will give a chance to the audience if you have any questions. What is the role of forgiveness in reconciliation? You said it's your favorite topic.
It is. And maybe it helps actually to clarify what we mean by forgiveness, or at least what social psychologists and researchers mean when they talk about forgiveness. Now, of course, it's a really difficult one to pin down, but the closest, or the one that I'm most comfortable with, goes like this. Forgiveness is a decision between two dimensions. On the one hand, you want to evaluate the value of that relationship with the perpetrator. How important is this person? How important is this group? How important is maintaining that relationship with the person or the group? And then on the other hand, you have to also weigh up how safe that relationship is. So what are the chances that the person or the group will repeat the aggression? So you're standing in front of that computational task between is it safe and how important is this relationship? And forgiveness lies somewhere in there. I must also add, every time I talk about forgiveness, whether research or public talk, they say that one of the most violent words in the English language is the word should. So anyone who tells you should forgive, just ignore them. So what's the role of forgiveness? Look, I think the role of forgiveness is connected to what Nurit was saying about reconciliation and also about these narratives. In many ways, we are whom we forgive. Right? Let me repeat that. We are whom we forgive. And what I mean by that is, depending on the importance of that relationship and the risk we take, and if we decide not to forgive, well, what does that mean for us? For us as the victim, for example. Well, I mean, there are different ways of coping with pain and suffering, but oftentimes we hold a grudge. Even if we move on, there's always that grudge, there's always that traumatic memory. Right? On the other hand, if you do forgive, well, forgiveness is not just an act that you do it one day and then you move on. I think it's a constant attitude, in the sense that it just opens a very challenging dialogue with the very person or the very group that you wish never existed even. But actually, once you engage in that dialogue, it's transformative of who you are, but also of who we are. So it always engages the other side. So for me personally, and scholarly, I think it's an under-researched topic. So if you have any funding, please channel it to our universities to do more research. But on a more serious note, I think 50% of forgiveness is about oneself. The rest is about the other and society.
I just had a question that starts with should, but I decided to change it.
You're a fast learner.
Yes. Well, it's difficult to rephrase, actually. Is it? Wait. Yeah, that's better. Is it the perpetrator that is to ask for forgiveness? And then the victim is to choose whether they would forgive or not? Or is it better if it's provided proactively by the victim?
Yeah.
And it's a very tricky question.
No, it's an important question. I mean, it's a project that we're working on. Look, in an ideal world, yes, The perpetrator side will acknowledge, will offer their sincere apologies, will even offer some compensation and engage with you, and you repair and you move on. But again, it's a perfect model that isn't represented in reality. Now, what are the consequences if that idealized model does not turn into reality? I mean, we can't leave, victims on their own, trapped in their victimhood, waiting for ages from the perpetrator side for an apology. And also, you mentioned in the context of the German Holocaust against Jewish and other groups, some of those original perpetrators are dying out, right? So who are we then now asking that apology from? And I'm actually German by nationality and also lived in Germany. And I studied German history, and I also noticed the impact of German history on my fellow German students. And there's a resistance sometimes as well. It's like, well, we weren't there. We're not responsible. Why are we, when is this going to get over? So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Not really.
You can't wait forever for an apology. Sometimes you might have to initiate and make the first move.
Okay, understood. Yes,
Would
you like
maybe
that?
I have, yes, a comment based on some research that, and again, I think that if we think, like Massi said, that in an ideal world, yes, of course, the perpetrators have to apologize, but there is like a famous saying of Paulo Freire that he says that the oppressed have the, it's their, the fate is to free themselves and the oppressors. And what they found in both in Australia, in some research in Australia and Canada, is that when the representative of the indigenous people expressed forgiveness, and for me it's inconceivable, so how can they forgive? Because they were subjected to such atrocities, but still if they expressed forgiveness, then for the white Australian and white Canadians, it was easier to apologize because the apology is risky, because you may apologize and then you will be just condemned even more. Okay, so now that you're admitting the injustice, you will be condemned more. So in a way, the victims, and again, I feel that it's unfair of me to say that, because then I'm putting the responsibility on the victims, but what they found in their research is that the victims can contribute to the process of apologizing if the perpetrators feel that it is less risky, that their apology will be well received. And again, well received is perhaps too strong, but that there will be some receptiveness to their apology. Because if you feel that whatever you do, it cannot be forgiven, which is, again, it is true for this kind of crimes, but still that there will be some receptiveness to your effort to make amends, then I think,
Yes.
so then the victims have the ability to set this process in motion, even
Yes,
though
I would say
it's not for their responsibility, moral.
It is not, maybe, but they actually do have power in this. They are the ones who decide whether they want to or do not want to forgive. And with power, there comes the responsibility. Sometimes, yes. But, yeah, I had a thought that just left. But Reza, you want to add something?
I can add to that. And, I'm linking this, the apology, forgiveness cycle to more broadly to issue of justice. Because sometimes we see there are debates that see justice versus reconciliation. Do you want justice or do you want reconciliation? And I think that's kind of a false little bit debate, because I think I don't think there can be actually proper reconciliation, like sustainable, peaceful society and just society without having some sort of justice. However, we need to rethink justice, right? We need to, because what we know from, again, from the needs-based model and some of my work on denial by perpetrator groups, right? Lack of acknowledgement, lack of apology. There is lack of acknowledgement because whoever perpetrated harm is seen as the incarnate evil, right? It's it means that you are immoral and you'll always be so. So when there is this kind of threat, it's very hard to accept, right? Because there is no there is no way to restore that morality, right? When you are seen as evil, and typically that's, the group are demarcated like that, the groups that perpetrate harm. However, if you give, I think we need to give both the perpetrator groups, right, a way to restore, right, the harm. Perpetrators are much more willing, they'll be more willing to acknowledge and apologize and take steps maybe if there is a route to restoring the morality through, for instance, ways to restore the harm that is done. Now, when you think about genocide, we have, of course, to think about what does it mean restoring harm, of course, in that setting. So we need to reimagine, re-envision, right, justice, what justice means, and redefine it. It's not about just punishing, right, a few perpetrators and punishing the group for forever, for generations. Right, we need to rethink that, and when you give that, right, when you give a way to restore, right, the kind of the morality and to be included and accepted in the kind of the community of moral, whether it's nations or individuals or, right, in the community, then there is, these processes and these cycles become much more likely.
I'm just thinking now that as the same as apology is risky, I would also say sometimes forgiveness is also risky, especially proactive forgiveness in this way, because it may also backfire from the perpetrator group. But yes, I remembered what I wanted to say. Just one last thing before questions is that actually when you said who are we to forgive or ask apology from if those people who perpetrated harm are dying, we have a finding, well, that's what you often hear in the region at least. What I also heard recently, that's the case in Colombia also. The same finding that people here in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, they say, we will reconcile when all the people related to war in any way die. So maybe there lies something, like when this memory or this narrative is softened maybe in a way, or changed or transferred to a future generation in a different way, or generations in a different way, and then these people who did not have direct contact or involvement with the conflict could be our hope, maybe. Yeah, Reza is doubtful.
Because these narratives like often get more, get even more even more rigid sometimes over generations, or so we have the case of the U.S., for instance, with slavery, and now there are, if you have followed some of the debates, there is a lot, of discussions and debates on the history of the U.S. and on the history of slavery and acknowledgement of that history and pushback, with the school curriculum, for instance, in the U.S. and how to teach that history and where it starts, which would be the starting date. Is it 1619 when the first slaves were brought to the Americas, or was it 1776 when the Declaration, when the independence was won? And the kind of the arguments that people bring back is like, oh, it's been so much time ago, right? There are no slaveholders right now. They are, we are not responsible because we are not, similar to your example, we're not responsible because we're not there. But the issue, it's different individual responsibility. Of course, you're not responsible. There is a collective, as a societal responsibility, to acknowledge, the harm and to acknowledge the legacy, that continues in the present. So it's not just about the past; it's about the present and those legacies. But the thing is, that's the tricky part, because in a way, we owe the good things about the past, the glories of the nation. It's, we always identify with, let's say, the founding fathers or all the great things and the values and of the nation and the accomplishments. But then when it comes to any negative side, it's like, oh, I'm not responsible, I was not there. So we cannot have, we cannot choose and pick. You have to do, either one or the whole package. The other. You have to take the whole package, exactly.
Okay. Thank you. I would like now to ask the audience if anyone has any questions or comments, would like to share their thoughts about these topics. Yes, can you just get her the microphone? Thank you.
Good evening. Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Maria Bulat. I come from the Regional Youth Cooperation Office. We also deal with reconciliation in the Western Balkans, but I'm not going to talk now about our work, but I will just, before asking the question, refer to one of the studies that we published last year in cooperation with the UN agencies from the region. It's called Shared Futures, and we examined the perceptions of young people from the Western Balkans about peace. And when I say young people, I mean young people from 15 to 30 years old, just to be clear with this. And now when we are talking about forgiveness, I would like to refer to one of the findings from that study, which is about willingness of young people to forgive. And the research that we did shows that there are differences between different ethnic groups in the region. One of the probably most, let's say, surprising was the fact that the young people from Kosovo, for example, 65% of them is not willing to forgive to the other group for what they did to their people in the past. So knowing that we are talking about people who were either very small children when, for example, the war in Kosovo started, or were not even born, that were born years after the war actually started, what would you say is the maybe right approach to the young people when we talk about reconciliation? So do you have maybe some recommendations in this regard? So how to approach them, how to deal with these topics with them when knowing, for example, that many of them who did not experience the conflict on their own skin, to say, are still suffering the consequences of those conflicts in this region. Thank you.
I figured.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks. That's very interesting finding. I think one thing that also we didn't maybe talk as much is the current status of the conflict and whether the conflict is really in the past or whether it's continuing. And I think with Kosovo, I mean, yes, the harm and was in the past, but there is still an ongoing conflict, and I think that also has an influence in people's perceptions. I'm not going to talk about that case, but I can give a case that I've kind of worked on, the Armenian genocide, which was over 100 years ago now, and from the Armenians' perspective, right? So Armenians, for instance, in the U.S., right, they didn't experience the genocide themselves. It was a few generations ago. Their grandparents were, of course, victimized, and they feel extremely strongly about anything related to the forgiveness is from what I know is out of question. It's just not relevant for many in that community, and it's almost, if it's discussed, it's sometimes even almost as an insult, because the genocide is not recognized, right? So that trauma, that grudge or that resentment and that trauma lives on in that community through generations, and it's partly because the genocide is not acknowledged. And it's interesting because, Turkey had some, they were trying to have this reconciliation effort. It's like, let's move beyond the past and let's reconcile, right? So that we can, we are brothers, or, we are, we have the same culture and, all these commonalities, partly because they wanted to move beyond. But, you cannot move beyond without acknowledging what happened and without acknowledging the genocide. So in that case, of course, genocide was in the past, but the conflict is continuing. So I think that really matters, and I don't have the right answer in terms of what you do with the youth, and but it's kind of an important factor, I think, that determines also to some extent people's kind of perceptions and views.
I want to say that perhaps the word forgiveness is too strong, and maybe I wouldn't encourage them or ask them about forgiving, but how about restoring the relations, or trying to cooperate towards common interests. And here I think that the interests are very important, and I can give two examples. One is in the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. So they were heavily criticized for compromising justice and promoting reconciliation at the expense of justice, like what Rizalta explained before. And I think that the question here is, what was the alternative? Okay, so if they pursued justice instead of reconciliation, then what would it lead to better lives of the people in South Africa? So I think that the level of alternatives or the alternatives is important. So in Kosovo, I'm not sure whether they can, so the question is whether they can benefit from improving their relations with the Serbs, not necessarily forgiving, but changing their mindset. Do you think that this is something that can benefit them? And if the answer is yes, and then I think, yes. So that and the second example that I wanted to give is that before the peace treaty with Egypt, so we had to give up Sinai. It's like a land, and people say, yeah, it's better to have Sinai without peace than peace without Sinai. And then what the prime minister at that time said, Begin, he said that the costs of peace are very heavy, but they're less heavy or the costs of war. So I think thinking about the alternatives can help this process.
If I may, Maria, I guess framing matters a lot here. Why was it not why did it not make the headline that 38% of young people were considering to forgive, right? And the most concrete thing you can do in terms of finding strategies to talk to those 38%. How did they get to that point, and what cultural practices, education stuff? So talk to them and study them. So I think that framing is really, really important. Another kind of applied strategy one could use is, it's used a lot, not a lot, oftentimes in the UK. There's a prison scheme, education scheme. So what happens is they design on a voluntary basis an encounter between a perpetrator and a victim, but they're not the original victim and perpetrator. So the victim has experienced, if I'm the victim and you're the perpetrator, we meet, but you were not my direct perpetrator. But you have done something similar to what my perpetrator did. And that dialogue seemed to have had huge positive impact, at least at a personal level. But again, going back, talk to those 38%. And I would really be interested in your study, if you can share with me.
Thank you. There was some, yes, Isidore?
So rather a comment, I don't know if it's a question, about the public apology and the impact it can have. You mentioned the apology of Australian and Canada government to their native people. And there was also apology of Netherlands to the transgender people on forced sterilization. Is apology enough? What needs to come before the apology, and what needs to come after the apology so that the true reconciliation can happen? So in your research, if you have something like that can be offered as a form of model or something for us in the civil sector, because Serbian government did had a declaration on Srebrenica about it being a genocide in 2010, and we still think as a society that it wasn't a genocide. So there was no impact on moving forward in that section. So what is your experience and research practice in this area? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you maybe, Nurit, like to?
Yeah, I would go back. Before I said that reconciliation is a process, it's not just the endpoint. So But there is work by Australian and Canadian researchers. They call it the staircase model of apology. And what they explain is that both in Australia and Canada, the members of the perpetrator group view the apology as the end point. So, okay, so we apologize and now we can move on. But for the indigenous population in both countries, it was like the starting. It said, okay, so you apologize now, we can begin with the reconciliation process. So I don't have a solution to that, but this is one of the things that they found, that is that the members of the victim group and members of the perpetrator group view the apology differently, as either the beginning or the end of the process. So I would say it should be the beginning or the middle or sometime at a certain point in the process, but it's not the end. It doesn't end.
Yeah, I just, from, actually some of the Canadian colleagues who did some research on apologies, what they find in terms of the public, so often there the public was also, before apology was given to the indigenous people, there was not as much support about giving the apology. However, when it's given, there were much more support, because the sky didn't fall. So people are much, although there might be opposition to start with, actually people then tend to to support more to a higher degree after the fact. And yeah, I would agree that apology is kind of the first. I see it as the acknowledgement, the public acknowledgement, and that something that happened that was wrong, and a commitment to apology also includes, it's not just I'm sorry, let's move on. It's I'm sorry, and here is what we're gonna do so that this doesn't happen again, and that so that we restore some of that harm that was done. And if those steps don't happen, right, it's just kind of hollow words without and I think the people on the receiving side, that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for those real actions that will actually have an impact in their lives, right, in terms of restoring the harm.
Just a quick response. I think one thing that we're all guilty of, both particularly as researchers, is that we often create models and do studies without paying sufficient attention to power and power relations, right? So I haven't done this study, but if anyone is willing to do it with me, I'm more than happy to collaborate with you. But I'd love to run a study where we can demonstrate that the needs, the psychological needs of the low status or the disempowered groups are different from those of powerful groups. To be honest, I'll use this as an example in class with my students, but I can imagine that as a Palestinian father living in Gaza, you know what? I don't need an apology. But if he can, remove those roadblocks that potentially can kill my ill daughter because it takes 4 hours or so to go to the emergency service, well, I'll appreciate that, and I see that as a sign of peace, as a sign of dignity, as a sign of trust, and rehumanizing me. So I think apologies are useful, but they're performative acts.
But yeah, there is a difference between, just to add, like in philosophy actually, between what's called apology and apologia. So with apologia being just the metaphorical, like the words like, oh, I'm sorry, but without the actions, right? So it's not a real apology, like right? It's
a token apology.
Yeah. I mean, and we know that even if you think of interpersonal conflicts, right? It's like, I said sorry, so, why are you still, yeah.
Okay, thank you. There was one more question. Yes, we have time for one more.
I'll be short and sweet.
Thank you.
So while you talked, I actually thought about the conversation that I had with people where that comparative and competitive victimization appeared. And actually Tina's last question and also Maria's gave a proper basis to mine, because I was born after the wars in the Balkans and everything, but often when I try to talk to the young people, it's really hard. It's really hard to approach them. And because there's a lot of aggression here, I mean, the mentality is really different, but yeah, the same from each of the sides. And here we don't have a clear picture who's a perpetrator and who's a victim, because everyone is both of those things. So my question is actually, what would be your practical advice or approach actually to competitive victimization? What would be your practical approach, like
to reduce competitive victimization?
What?
To reduce it, or
no, like more like in discussions with persons when you notice that this is their point of view, and that because I catch myself doing the same things what I see that other people are doing. Like I'm usually having to defend all the other sides. And like in the Balkans, I think that other countries besides Serbia really have to fight for the victim role here. And that still happens, of course. And like we are 30 years away from the events, but it still happens. And then I get into that role, and I'm like, no, but that happened as well, that happened as well, that happened as well. And I actually create the competitive victimization circle. So my question is actually... Yeah, that's why I asked, like, what would be maybe your practical approach, how to avoid that, how to, you know, actually start a better, mature conversation in order to actually achieve reconcile.
Thanks for that question. That's difficult. I don't think that will give the quick fixes
that was
here.
My
there
comment.
is no quick fix. But Diana mentioned this idea about inclusive victim beliefs and inclusive victimhood. So different from the competitive or what we call exclusive victimhood, people also, there is another concept of inclusive victimhood. The idea that people acknowledging that other people or other groups have also suffered similarly to your group. So in our research, we have assessed both, you know, these exclusive or competitive victimhood and inclusive victimhood, and they can, you know, you can have both, you know, you can keep both of those beliefs at the same time. You can believe that your group has suffered in unique ways and differently, but also that there are similarities in the suffering. And what we find from our research, including in the region, is that, you know, inclusive victimhood is related to more reconciliatory attitudes and more willingness to be in contact with the other groups and a whole host of different positive outcomes. So then the question would be, how do we, you know, can we maybe, instead of like targeting the competitive piece, which is kind of maybe harder to do it directly, can we, you know, can we promote more, right, that of the inclusive, right, victimhoods through, I don't think through arguing with the narratives, it's really the approach, because people are always in the defensive. But, you know, the sharing, for instance, of personal stories. We were talking with Mia yesterday about, you know, the children's museum in Sarajevo, where you share personal stories of conflict. And across the conflict, if you go really to individual personal stories, you'll see a lot of, right, also similarities in the experiences of, right, suffering and victimization. It doesn't mean that there are no, right, differences and no power, right, inequalities, etc. But those also, right, they kind of break that, I think, that kind of defensiveness and that, you know, that fighting spirit that, you know, the groups have in establishing some of those, right, commonalities and moving beyond this desire to, right, of competitive narratives. And rather than talking just about groups, you actually are talking about, right, real people, right, in all sides of the conflict. So that would be my kind of my thinking.
Look, I think you know, in those conversations, and I can empathize with you, and those conversations, we always get trapped into them. I think one thing that I find useful, I haven't done research on it, but situationally I've experienced, is to ask the question of, who do you want to be? And what other conversation could we have instead of this? Can we reimagine a different talking about us and them? It's maybe not as practical as you might want it, but I think one of the biggest challenge in prolonged conflict is that we have not had space or time to reimagine alternative relations, worlds, but also selfhood. Who do I want to be? You don't want to spend the rest of your life, engaging in vicarious competitive.
Maybe I'll just add one more thing. I'm sorry. I'll just add one more thing. I think the people are ideas about conflict that we get, not necessarily just group conflict, but conflict in general, right? We have, even from the media, from the movies, Hollywood movies, we have these ideas, one is the bad guy and the good guys, right? So we have that story that is ingrained in our minds, even from folk stories, from, since early childhood, that there is, right, the bad guy and the good guy, and we need to find who is the bad guy and good guy. And those, and I use those scripts in understanding, right, even intergroup conflict. So if you hear about a conflict in area of the world that you don't know much about, I think immediately search, okay, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys here? And we do that, of course, in the conflicts that we are involved in. Of course, if you are involved, it's like we are the good guys, so the other are the bad guys. So then you need to engage in those narratives to support, right? Because if we also have that harm, it means that we might be the bad guys, right? And I think this is very destructive because conflicts that's not in reality, right? Conflicts are much more complex. So, I think that the good versus evil type of narratives that are not necessarily just related to specific conflicts, that we have those scripts and we use those scripts to understand, right, all the conflicts that we're involved in, they are really destructive. So we might actually, right, go back to, having this deep cultural change, which is very difficult. I don't think it helps you in a interpersonal, right, conversation about, we have to break down, we have to get rid of those good versus evil stories because that's part of the problem, I think.
It's called moral, in the literature, moral typecasting. So you cast one side to be the good guy, and the other must be the bad guys. But it's more complicated than that. But I would say that if people tell you about the suffering of their party, I would say, if I want to give a practical advice, would be to acknowledge that and just be there and listen. And once people feel that you listen to what they have to say and that you acknowledge their suffering, they're more open to hear the other party. Or maybe they don't necessarily need to hear that. It's just the feeling of acknowledgement is very reassuring, I think.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of this conversation because I had some more questions here, but we would have to organize something again, to meet again. I would like to thank you very much once more for flying from different parts of the world to be here tonight with us and sharing your thoughts about this topic and your knowledge and your research. And thank you again. And I would like to invite the audience and also our guests to, if you would like, you could stay here. We would have this space for reconciliation, as we call it. It's an hour of different interactive games, maybe, that we prepared for you. And you're welcome to stay and to enjoy it, but also you could help yourselves with some coffee and some snacks outside and just continue this conversation. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pravo pomirenje jeste volja da čujete drugu stranu, sve njihove strahove i sve njihove name.
Ako mi ne otvorimo teška pitanja, drugi će otvoriti naše ratove.
Lakše je biti junak nego čovjek.
Konflikt se stvori za čas, a pomirenje gradimo godinama. Moramo da pričamo o tome.